Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Craig Holliday from the Association for Spiritual Integrity, and with me is a good friend and deeply respected teacher, David Buckland. David is someone who is known for his awakened vision, his humility. He's been meditating for over 45 years now. He briefly taught as a TM teacher and has a master's in Vedic science, which is essentially Eastern philosophy, for those of you who don't know what Vedic science is. He's been featured on the popular YouTube show Buddha at the Gas Pump numerous times, and someone who I just deeply love and respect. So I thought I'd have him on the show today. And the idea of this show is for spiritual teachers to come together and to speak and to share in an open-hearted way, a humble way, and a direct way about their experience, about different ethical challenges they've faced in their own personal and professional lives, as well as what they see within the cultural spirituality. And so welcome today, David. So good to have you.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here, Greg.
Yeah. So David, I might just start off with, just a couple of basic questions for you, just to get the conversation going. David, with the many years that you've been on the path, and you've been, like you said, meditating or practicing TM for 45 years, that's a long time. What are some of the great ethical challenges that you've personally experienced or witnessed along the path?
Well, thank you, Greg. I would say that there's been many sort of smaller level things over the years. There's always been, of course, egos involved in any spiritual circle, and so I've seen many examples where people have not been treated with a fair and ethical way by the spiritual organizations and so forth. There's the expectation in most spiritual circles, for example, that you behave in certain ways and follow, certain protocols and so on, which is, it's perfectly suitable to do so. But more concerning for me has been people who have become spiritual teachers in some way on their own and don't have a support network, don't listen to feedback, see themselves as somehow above all that, and then basically bring their garbage into their teaching environment and dump on their students. Or one of the more difficult ones for me was a good friend kind of went off the rails and started basically culturing codependent relationships with his students and creating a big mess.
And was this someone that you were like a student of, or are you guys colleagues and friends?
A friend, yeah.
Yeah.
And he rejected feedback from us, and he got into this thing of trying to do public shaming. There was kind of a thing where he was puffing up his students, and then he would try and do public shaming if they did anything, the slightest thing that he didn't like. And he tried to do that with me as well when I tried to give him some feedback about it. And wasn't receptive and still isn't.
And that's been I know that firsthand, that can be really painful. When I was quite young, I used to go, I had like my core teacher, but then I used to go visit, with different teachers, say that would come to Boulder, Colorado, or Santa Fe, anywhere within, 8 or 10 hours of where I live. And I noticed that too, is I met a teacher who was really powerfully enlightened in that Papaji lineage. And he used to implore that as well as this, I don't want to call it a technique, but it kind of was like a technique of public shaming. And not only would he shame an individual who challenged him in the satsang hall, but there was like a groupthink within the community that would also shame that individual as well. And I found it, tremendously confusing, because the teacher was offering something, a teaching that I thought was pretty solid and pretty helpful. I was having big experiences when I would go and do little retreats with this teacher. But then the thing that was happening, between him, and it was almost like he was picking on students, that just really created confusion within my own consciousness. So are you speaking about like a similar type of thing?
Yes, along that line. And the challenge was some of his students knew me through my contact with him, and so I was contacted by some of them afterwards, and they found it really difficult because on the one hand, like you say, they experienced some value, but also he had created a codependent relationship with some of them as well, and they accepted that kind of relationship, and so that they weren't able to leave him.
Yeah.
And yeah, and so they
Yeah.
didn't know.
Why don't you explain that a little bit, or define that for the viewers? What exactly do you mean by a codependent relationship? What does that mean, and how, we've heard about having a codependent relationship, say, with our partner, if we're married or in relationship, but how would we have that with a spiritual teacher? Could you give an example what that might look like?
Well, it's based on dependency and feeling. I mean, you'd probably be able to define this better than me, but with your background as a therapist, but essentially creating dependencies and tapping into needs and uh, egoic level functioning.
Yeah.
So rather than appealing to someone's higher nature, they're appealing to someone's lower nature, and
Yeah.
using fear and shame and so on like that to control students and to get the ego aggrandizement that they're looking for, or whatever form that takes. And this can be really on a real coarse level, really overt, um, uh, obvious level, but it can also be quite subtle. That's one thing I found really interesting over the years. Once you start to see that pattern, or see that present in certain teachers or
Yeah.
people, you start to realize how subtle it can sometimes be. And of course, we're all humans, so it's almost possible to be perfectly clean, and we have to allow for that. But there is that subtle idea in spiritual circles, particularly in non-dual circles, um, around the perfection of the teacher. And there is texts that talk about perfection post enlightenment, but there's two things there. For one, they're talking about probably a more advanced level than most people are today, and they're also talking about a different time. To explain that, consciousness as a whole moves in cycles, long cycles. They call it yugas in India. Um, the Greeks refer to the ages as well, and it's in various cultures around the world. But essentially, consciousness goes through these long cycles of rising and falling clarity. And so we're right now rising out of a time of darkness, of shadow, the low part of the cycle. And we're in a rising cycle, and it's quite an exciting time because so many people are waking up now. But some of those texts are from a time when we were in a higher age, when enlightenment was far more common, and people were able to reach much, much more, from this context, cleaner levels of being.
So you're saying like they wouldn't have so much emotional baggage and.
Yeah, they didn't come up with as much baggage. They're in an environment that supports a healthy emotional life, and so on. And so that kind of stuff is unloaded and cleaner and purer. So you end up with teachers who are awake in a level that it's not possible to be, I don't think, in the current time.
Yeah.
So there is a kind of perfection, and there certainly is a kind of perfection in action after awakening. But part of that is a perceptual thing, because you're seeing you're seeing your actions in a much larger context. There's less drivers, less of those old drivers that were obvious that would be triggering, the me and my wants and so on. And so and a lot of stuff comes from an inner place. There's a kind of flow of consciousness within that speaks for itself through you. And so there can be certainly this sense of being perfect, and also there's this idea that with awakening, that the ego dies, and that can be a very clear experience. I had that experience myself. But what I gradually learned over time was it wasn't so much that the ego died, it was that the attachment to the ego that died.
Yeah.
But
And
that's still,
that's a huge distinction, that the attachment to the ego died versus, all ego within this consciousness
yes, exactly.
completely and totally dissolved. Before you go on too much, David, I just
Yes.
want to clarify one thing, because I think it's an important point you're making, is that these texts, which were written, say, thousands of years ago, were written during a different time, a different period, say in theory like a golden age, where someone could reach a higher level of perfection. Whereas right now, correct me if I'm wrong, but we're rising out of the Kali Yuga, correct?
Yeah, it depends on your interpretation. In some have suggested, Yukteswar's, Yogananda's master, went back to the old texts and saw that an error had crept in during the Dark Age in the calculation. In the popular and the common calculations, we're still, we're actually early in the Dark Age.
Yeah.
But in the Yukteswar calculation, which actually corresponds to the precession of the equinoxes and various astronomical
Yeah.
things, we've risen into the Dwapara Yuga, or energy age, and that does correspond with a number of historical things that have happened. But there's also this other thing going on too, which is I don't know, an overlay on that, where we're in a kind of growing golden age within the lower age, which is why you're seeing so many people wake up
Yeah.
in the current
And also, if those two things are going on right now, that also begins to explain like the great paradox of people waking up, but also waking up in such a time of darkness, or such a time
time.
of confusion. And so the point here that I just wanted you to clarify is that because these texts were written in say a time of a golden age, then therefore one could reach a higher level and they wouldn't have so much psychological confusion. Whereas now, in this current age where we're rising, but simultaneously there's a lot of heaviness,
Yes.
we're having the experience we're having now, where you could have teachers who have really bright minds and really uh, clear realizations, yet at the same time perhaps have real messy psychologies. And I can even say personally within my own self, this was something of just great confusion. When I was young and I was meeting with this non-dual teacher in the Papaji lineage, and I saw that he had a really clear mind, great transmission, but of course there was this confusion there. And then later on, as I began to grow on the path and mature and start to have greater and greater experiences, I started to find the same thing within my own self. And I found it very confusing that, oh, there's, I can have a tremendous clarity. Then, the next day or the next week, be sidelined from something from my own shadow or my own ego. And it took me many years, to respond with compassion to myself. And a funny thing happened is the more compassion I had for myself, then the more that ego that you're talking about, say ego death, it wasn't that the ego died. It was more like the positive aspects the ego could integrate, and the unhealthy neurotic aspects could dissolve and let go and
Yes.
release himself from my consciousness more fully than had I just held on to some mythical understanding enlightenment, or because one is awake, therefore they are perfect. To me, that just seems silly. To have that as an ideal. One of the things that happens, I think, as we mature, we become much more humble. Would you agree?
Oh yes, yeah. What surprised me over the years is there's a there's a sense of for me of cleaning things out and resolving some of that old past over gradually over time. I mean, the awakening itself is like an instant, but then there's this all this unpacking and integration and embodiment and this whole process that has to take place. And it's not a single. There isn't a single event in that context. It's just there's a whole process. Just like becoming a teenager. This isn't a different kind of human development in that sense. It's just a higher level of it, we could say. So there's still a process of integrating.
Yeah.
There, and it surprised me over time is it's kind of in layers. So I think, oh, this area is all cleaned out and done, and then some new, more subtle value comes to the surface that's been quietly hidden. In our culture, we get a lot of energetic modeling for suppression. You're not supposed to express anger in it, or grief, or these kinds of things in public, or with proper company. And so what do you do with those emotions? We don't get healthy models, and so we learn to suppress this stuff and then hide it in various kinds of ways. And that can be healthy on one level, because we need to be able to still function in the world after a major trauma. But at a certain point, we do have to come back to that stuff and deal with it. But we're not taught skills in our culture to do that. And so we end up, basically building this backlog. And then, a lot of that happened when we were young as well, where, fear and shame and so on like that are used as normal parenting techniques in our culture. And, we can clear a lot of that off, but some of that stuff can be surprisingly subtle.
Oh, absolutely. And I think, one of the big things, especially in the United States, is we have all these mass shootings. It seems like one happens, at least every week, if not, of course, every month. But it's ridiculous, and I think it's really a testament to what you're describing, is when we repress and when we have just a culture of repression and just keep, just stuffing things into our unconsciousness, eventually it explodes. And, this is true whether we're a teenage boy or, hell, it's even true with great spiritual teachers, who, we saw it back in the 60s and the 70s with, the great gurus who were coming over from India. And it wasn't long before, they were getting involved in sex scandals, or, scandals having to do with money and power. Because, in the ashram, they didn't have much training. If you're a monk, what's the teaching on on physical intimacy? There is none. That's the teaching. You come to the United States, and where there's, all kinds of, intimacy happening. It's easy for a teacher who didn't examine that within themselves. Then all of a sudden, for those energies to come forward, and then there's great, there can be great tragedy. And so to me, it just makes perfect sense. If we repress something, we haven't dealt with it, that, yeah, it's going to come out. It's going to come out in the wash. I mean, basically, it's going to come out in our life. And, of course, Ken Wilber, he spoke in great detail about this. He coined that phrase, waking up, growing up, and then cleaning up. And so many of us are really enthused on the spiritual path just to wake up. We forget about, the growing up and the cleaning up. And, I can even say personally, I did. I put the growing up, I put that on the back burner for many years. And, I just wanted to do anything and everything to serve my teacher, to go on constant retreat. And
yes, you actually,
yeah.
You raise an important point there as well, because another thing out of the dark age that we've risen, or we're rising out of, is that there was a strong emphasis on renunciation. Shankara came along and revived the monastic tradition that had faded in India, and 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 during the Dark Age, it's very difficult to make spiritual progress in the world, and so there was an emphasis on renunciation for a time, but that emphasis really no longer is valid in the current time for most people. A very small percentage of people are suited for a long-term renunciate approach, and yet that teaching is dominant in a lot of teachings, a lot of cultures. And so the approach to awakening is all around renouncing the ego, renouncing the world, and so on. And we don't get those skills for cleaning up and growing up, because that's not part of a renunciate requirement when you're off in an ashram or a monastery somewhere. And but if you're in the world, those are quite necessary and important.
Oh, absolutely. I can even, think when I was young, and my teacher, he had a strong renunciate background as well. And so it was interesting when I met him. I just felt this natural inclination, just to renounce everything. And I was even celibate for a couple of years in my 20s, and can remember just reading books, reading texts by Vivekananda or Ramakrishna and Yogananda. You hear all these about the great joys of being celibate and renouncing the world and this and that. And one of the things that happened is I started to take that on, but for me it didn't feel like a joyous thing. It actually felt like a battle, and I felt like, because I didn't have a bunch of brothers, like a bunch of brother monks around me, and my teacher, he never wanted to have a really big spiritual community. He liked things very small and intimate. There wasn't that support system, say of the ashram, of the say the brother monks. And I remember just digging around in the text looking for anything like, how do you deal with all this pressure that's building when you're 20 years old and you're celibate. And I didn't find any. I didn't find it. After 2 years of being celibate, I just couldn't keep it up.
Yes, I understand entirely. One of my teachers back in the day, he had a book, and in the back he talked about the yogas or paths to enlightenment, and the basic idea. And of course, I took this to be an absolute: you were on this path, or you were on this path, or you were on this path. And there's the path of devotion, path of the intellect, path of karma. And so I looked at this and read the descriptions, and I have a strong mind, so I thought, I must be on the intellect path, the path of the intellect, jnani. And there's an aspect of that here, but but what the text said was this is the path of the renunciate, because you can't do this close analysis without withdrawing from the world. But I was not aware of any way to do that, and of course I had no support for. It wasn't what I was supposed to be doing, so there's absolutely no support for me going in that kind of direction and trying to become a monk. And so, but it did create confusion for me for a couple of years, where I tried to figure out what I was supposed to be in that. But when I just let that go and let it be natural, then I saw that I was actually, reflecting back on it now, I see I'm much more the karma yogi, which is also the path of perception, and that's been a strong part of the process here. And but it's kind of like a number of things. You don't tend to be in one box or another. It's sort of most people tend to be a bit of a blend, and they'll have these aspects. But and as we've talked previously too, we both have a past life history with being monks, and so that tends to encourage the idea to come up again.
Yeah. And it's a funny thing, because I was, like you were described before, with that sense of repressiveness or suppression. I was using that the teachings on renunciation as like a form of spiritual violence to my own humanity. And like you were describing, when I was young, I thought the path was, it's either this way or that way. And the way I understood it was real basic, was like the monastic path was the fast track. And the worldly path, well, that's really slow. So I said, well, yeah, well, I want to be on the fast track, of course. So I'll do anything. And what I eventually found was, I actually found actually being the quite opposite for me personally was, as soon as I got into family life and all, the pressures and the energies and the difficulty, it's like, oh, my spiritual path became very rich, very alive. It didn't feel dry or boring in any way. It was full of energy. And it's like something came alive within my own consciousness. And that was real helpful because all that repressed energy was able to release itself. And oftentimes in a really messy way, in a messy way. But again, it's like the truth. The truth will, it'll sort everything out. If you let it flow. And so
And
for
it's
me,
very hard in that kind of situation, in a family, when you have a family, to be in some kind of detached, uh, abstracted way, or to be bypassing. Well, there's certainly subtle kinds of bypassing go on there too, but in spirituality, it's really easy to escape off into your own little world and co-opt spiritual techniques to be used to avoid
yeah,
our trauma or unhealed areas,
yeah,
and be in a kind of detached place or whatever. And yet that's not what our spiritual path needs in often cases. And so where you get called into a family scenario, you got to be there with it.
yeah.
It's very demanding.
You got to
And
be present. You got to be awake. You have to know what compassion is. I mean, it will
yeah,
certainly show you what unconditional love is much more quickly than,
yeah,
just sitting on a meditation cushion by yourself. If you want to know unconditional love,
yes,
like have some kids,
exactly, yes.
and they'll challenge every aspect of you. And sometimes when I speak about unconditional love, people think I mean, oh, just like this gooey, oozy, like heart chakra thing. And what I'm speaking about is unconditional, meaning when the kids are giving you hell, when they're giving you a hard time, your wife or your partner or whoever it is giving you a
Yeah,
hard time, can you show up in love then?
yeah. And partners, intimate partners, are such a mirror
Yeah,
for your stuff, because they reflect it back at you.
yeah,
Children in a different way, because children are kind of they. I remember at a certain point with my oldest son, uh, this behavior he was expressing, and I realized that it was a caricature of
yeah,
my own stuff. And I was like, oh my God, do I actually behave this way?
yeah, yeah. I saw the same thing actually the other day. My teenage daughter, who's getting ready to go away to college, the way she was kind of like shunning me or mocking me, I realized, oh wow, that's something that that was buried deep within me, and something I used to do many many years ago. I said, oh yeah, look, she's repeating that and is bringing it forward, to be seen. And yeah, it can be embarrassing, it can be humbling, and of course, it's an opportunity to grow and to notice, is there some more of that stuff hanging around still,
That's
conscious.
a big change time too, for having your oldest going off to college.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it is. And you know how it is, kids, when they're going away to college, it's healthy for them to individuate. And so sometimes they'll take a crowbar and put it between, you and your relationship with them. And from a developmental perspective, that's very healthy.
Yeah,
From an attachment perspective, of course, it hurts. And
yeah,
these are the types of things we face, when we have kids, and going back to that, speaking about, spiritual teachers and communities, oftentimes I've seen the opposite happen. When a student is actually, in a real sense, learning to stand on their own 2 feet and outgrowing the teacher or outgrowing, say, the sangha, which is a natural, healthy thing that can happen on the path. I've seen teachers, hold on to a student or create greater dependency, um, for, to maintain whatever kind of codependent relationship that they're having with the student. And of course, that's tremendously unhelpful. And I've seen a teacher do it before, and I've also seen groups do it
Yes.
before, where the group will, shame the individual who's wanting to step forward and make, make some new leaps in their evolution. And I'm speaking about, of course, a leap outside of the community, not within the community.
Yes, I've seen that also, and you even see those scenarios where they'll not just shun somebody, but they'll try to block them from various things. They'll follow them around, and all kinds of weird behaviors you get into in some organizations.
Yeah, I
And
mean, that's cult-like stuff,
yeah, yeah,
following
you
the
can't get
figure.
into that. Fortunately, I've never been in and out myself, but
Yeah.
there's certainly that kind of thing. I've seen examples of it around, and yeah, it can be challenging, and
Yeah.
just within the organizations, that you can be shamed for just trying to talk about it. You're because stepping away from from your source of understanding and so on. Your sangha, it's that can be your become your life at certain points, your social life and so
Yeah.
on like that. And stepping away from that can be challenging, and to have people within that telling you you're wrong, and you should
Yeah.
never do that, and so on like that,
Yeah.
is, yeah, it's not helpful.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, because I've always been someone who's been just really curious and fascinated about you know what all the different groups know. And so, and by that I mean, with my main root teacher, it was truly a path of yoga. He was like a master yogi, and so I went very deep, in that lineage. But then, of course, I wanted to know, oh, well, what do the Zen Buddhists know? What do the Tibetan Buddhists know? What does, what do the Christians know? What does this group know? What does that group know? What do the non-dual folks know? And so I had this deep relationship with my root teacher, but then I liked to travel and just spend a little time, going deep, say, with the Tibetans. And it was very interesting because, and I actually spent a lot of time at we have a big Tibetan temple kind of where I live out in the mountains. And I used to volunteer there a bunch and be close with the teachers there. But it's interesting, as soon as I set foot on that land, I could just feel the lineage, but within the lineage, I could feel also just all these psychological ties to the lineage, like the heaviness of the group, the thought patterns, the belief systems, uh, and you'll feel it real quick, like all the unspoken rules and the ways of doing things.
Yeah.
And I had a funny experience there because I was a part of did a little bit of work in this Tibetan lineage, which was a mother lineage, and so there's a lot of women within this, within this community. And I noticed, the shadow side of it, from some of the women was there was a like a distrust towards men. And so there was a lot of times when I would, be, just in group meetings or whatever, and I would just feel this, the heaviness of distrust towards men. And I always thought, what is this about? And it's very confusing for me. And so there, I think lineages and spiritual communities are very much like families. They have their belief systems, they have orientations, they have, oftentimes a lot of love and things that are going really well. But then, of course, like anything that has a form has a shadow. There can be little shadows within the community. And because I traveled around so much, um, I got to witness, some of these shadows, and I got to witness the unspoken rules of, oh, it's like you have to take off your shoes and take off your socks too. It's like, oh, okay. You can't just raise your hand and ask the teacher a question. Oh, okay, that's the rule here. You can't just raise your hand and ask the teacher a question. There's this process that you have to go through first. You have to be there for a certain number of meetings or whatever it is before you can, you can't say anything personal, or, all these silly little rules within spirituality. And I've always been amazed at how seriously people take these rules. Like when I was young and, was a Catholic, at the Catholic Church, I didn't take any of the rules seriously, but what I found is over the years, some people, not only did they take those rules seriously, they experienced trauma from those rules, and then they developed like a hatred or anger towards Christ or towards the church because of the rules of the church. And in some cases, rightly so, but in other cases, it's like, hey, no one's telling you you have to buy into guilt and shame. The priest may be saying that, but but in your heart, you don't have to do that. You don't have to do that to yourself. But so many people do. And I think
Yeah.
it creates great confusion within individuals.
One of the things I've noticed too is back in the 70s, spiritual groups were quite siloed. And you
Say
tried
that again. They were quite,
siloed. They were kind of in their own little boxes.
yeah,
And you were viewed by other people would view you as competent. Different groups were seen as competition in some way.
yeah,
And there was kind of, if you went into a different group and you had a background with something else, they were always kind of like suspicious of you and
yeah,
so on like that. I noticed there's a lot more opening now today with between spiritual groups, and a lot more, well, things like the Science of Non-Duality Conference, where people are coming together from many different
sure,
spiritual perspectives. And there's a lot more openness to talk about different perspectives. And it's fine. You choose the perspective you favor. But that part of it has matured quite a bit. There's still a little bit of I see here and there, but
yeah,
but yeah,
yeah, and especially, of course, with the power of the internet, is just sharing the teachings, and it seems like it's everyone I meet. They know, they might know a little something about Tibetan Buddhism, a little something about Zen Buddhism, and a little bit of non-duality and some yoga sprinkled in here. And I think that's how our world is changing. It's just becoming more united because there's just so much more information out there. But it is interesting because it's just like, I was describing with a family, you spend some time, together in any kind of group. And, we saw this in that Netflix series, Wild Country, with the Osho community. It's like, oh, there's whole kinds of all this groupthink that comes forward, inner politics, power struggles. That's always been an interesting one for me to watch is,
yeah,
you can walk into a song and pretty quickly see, who are the quote unquote senior students. And, unfortunately, I've even seen senior students just vying, for power, like, in a
yeah.
sense, even boxing for power.
Yes,
And
I know people who have left sanghas because of that. They fall out of favor in some way with the senior students, and they're just they're treated badly, and or
yeah,
whatever. Various kinds of things that can happen.
yeah, yeah, can get really confusing and really heartbreaking too. I often think, so much of this is it's unnecessary. It's unnecessary. It's just unnecessary suffering and within the community.
Well, some spiritual organizations too that strike me as being like karma machines. That
Yeah,
they're just kind of like ways of working out your stuff, and it's like, okay, let's.
yeah, yeah. No, I think there's a lot of truth in that. From a big picture, yeah, it's all evolution. There's great evolution that happens, and within the community that I was speaking about. The first time when I was young and met with this teacher who used to do the public shaming. Eventually the community crashed, but a lot of the individuals, they grew tremendously. But to me, they grew tremendously through intense pain, intense confusion, through existential, just big
Yeah,
dramas on a big stage. And
there can be easier ways to do it. Yes.
there can be easier ways, and that's a big thing that the ASI is about. Is we're hoping uh, to educate both teachers and students so that we can just all show up in a more adult and mature way. I was listening to Tammy Simon speak a number of years ago, and I think she was speaking about her relationship with the Buddhist teacher Reggie Ray, and she said the thing that she appreciated about him in particular was, she showed up as an adult and he showed up as an adult. And so because the two of them, weren't playing all those codependent games and the psychological games and doing the pecking order game and all this, and, they could just grow together and learn together. And the relationship was really healthy and beneficial. And, that's a big thing that we're wanting at the ASI is, how can we show up more and more as adults, in this profession so that we can better serve.
Yeah, just because someone has an awakening doesn't mean they're supposed to be a teacher. Teaching is a skill in itself.
Yeah.
And just because someone's a spiritual teacher doesn't mean they know how to deal with psychological issues or resolve trauma. I mean, some of that, you see that playing out in some sanghas where there's a lot of exploration of that. But one of the things I found with when ASI launched, I found it really useful to take a step back and take a look at my own approach. And, I have a web page on my site that lists recommended people helping with Kundalini problems or psychological challenges or whatever, with links to various resources. And the ASI discussions made the boundaries more clearly defined, where it was appropriate for me to refer people. So I refer people a little more quickly than I might have otherwise before, because I'm not a psychologist or therapist or that. I don't have Kundalini skills, that kind of stuff. So it's really good to be able to support other people. And some teachers think somehow they should be able to support people.
Yeah, I think so. David, I think you bring up a very interesting point, because that's one of those unspoken rules or myths, I think, that happens is spiritual teachers, the idea of being a spiritual teacher comes with that baggage of all-knowing, it's just like an all-knowing presence. And, I think it's very important to know what are the limits of your skills? What are the limits of your competencies? Is how we say this in the world of counseling. Like, if you're not trained in trauma, you don't work with trauma. If you're not trained with addiction, you don't work with addiction. If you're not trained in into life issues, you don't deal with that. And
but even for students too, the idea you would go and bring your traumas to your spiritual teacher, or something else I was going to throw in there with that, but just the idea that you would bring those things to the teacher, it's that they have a different function.
And my teacher's wife, she told me when I was young, when I was first going to see Amma, this was 20 something years ago, and I was probably 20 years old, and I just had this feeling, I'm going to go meet this incredible guru. She's going to know every single thing about me, all my past lives and my future lives. She's going to know the answer to every single question, you could ever imagine. She's enlightened. Therefore, it means she knows everything. And, my teacher's wife saw that I had this idea, and she kind of just came along, just popped the bubble. She's like, Craig, just because, she's a great guru and realized being doesn't mean she knows everything. And I was like, but because I had read, probably a stack of spiritual books, like at that time, I used to just devour books, and you'd hear about these most perfect enlightenments and, how, someone's enlightened, mosquitoes don't bother them. They can walk on water. You just hear all these stories, and it's just silly, and we're young, and, I'll say we're gullible, and, our heart's open, and we're innocent and naive. But a lot of people, even people who are older and quite mature, I found, still hold on to this mythological idea, that you're describing.
Yeah, I mean, one of the classics I remember for myself was the idea that I was going to become enlightened. but it's not that me
Yeah.
that becomes enlightened. It's enlightenment is post-personal. It's development of the cosmic self.
Yeah.
You go beyond the me. You wake up from the me is a better way to look at it. And so it's really not a personal goal in that kind of sense. We can certainly personally do work to help prepare the ground to make it make us more ripe, so to speak, or more able to sustain a shift. But the shift itself isn't has nothing to do with the person.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's a big thing. And then, of course, then that teaching can get flipped the other way, you know, when people can say, there is no person here. And, you
Yeah,
know, you shouldn't ever take anything personal or whatever it is. And then, you know, I've seen teachers use that as an excuse to get away, in a sense, with murder.
yeah, yeah. And there is also the difference between making a mood of that and having it as your actual experience. Because there are people who go through what I would consider a phase where
Yeah.
there's a detachment and uninvolvement, personless. But really, enlightenment is about integration of all the parts of ourselves.
Yeah.
And to suggest that there is no person here, that if you stub your toe, that you don't feel it, is
Yeah.
silly. I mean, we do have a default. We do experience from here normally, not from over there.
Yeah.
There's that capacity develops at a certain point, but we still have this default for coming back and experiencing through this body mind. And to suggest it's invalid, I mean, there's a certain teaching around that, but you know that kind of comes back to the renunciate teachings as well. If you're trying to renounce the world, then certainly it's valid to favor an egoless kind of state. But most of us are here in the world, and so not acknowledging that there's an ego in here then allows us to, like you said, not acknowledge the stuff that the ego has to deal with still, and or that's still there in the person in some way, and that allows the person to be crazy and do stupid things and just like, oh well, that was God speaking through me, you know, or whatever, and
Yeah.
make crazy excuses. But
Yeah.
that's lacking in discrimination there.
Yeah, and I think that's an important thing that you described there. It's lacking in discrimination, and you know, I can say I've because I work with so many students from so many different teachers. I've seen that one come up time and time again, where, like you're describing in the beginning, it's healthy for a student and teacher to have, you know, open feedback loops.
Yes.
When those feedback loops are closed, and by that I mean if the teacher is unwilling to receive feedback, uh, boy, have I spent time just counseling individuals who tried to give feedback to a teacher and then were shamed or told they don't understand because they're not at the same level of enlightenment as the teacher or whatever it was. And,
Yeah.
you know, too often it was used just to dismiss unwholesome behavior. And it's heartbreaking, you know, because
Yeah.
a lot of times it takes great courage for a student to come forward and to speak up and to question a teacher. You know, the Buddha offered that teaching, you know, like question everything I say,
Yeah.
you know. But I think,
Yeah, it's very challenging. Like I mentioned, my friend going off the rails, and I knew a number of people in his local sangha,
yeah,
and you know, and it was very very difficult for
yeah,
several people that I knew well.
yeah. I mean, it's heartbreaking too if it happens to, you know, a friend and someone you love and respect. And, you know, like you said before, it's confusing too because, you know, they have so much good to offer. You see the good work they're doing in the world, and then uh, you know, sometimes it can just be like a little bit of, you know, something just a little bit off can just throw
Yeah,
mud on a lot of the goodness that they're sharing.
yeah. I mean, in this case, for example, I had written several articles about them and or about their teaching, and I had to take those articles down because I didn't want to be. I didn't think it was appropriate for them to be for people to go to them
Yeah,
anymore.
yeah, yeah. Well, David, I'm really sorry to hear about that. That is because it breaks your heart, you know.
Yeah,
That,
and I can only hope that you know that resolves itself. It hasn't yet, uh,
yeah,
but people do go through periods sometimes.
Yeah.
They get caught in their stuff for a little while, and that's just how life is sometimes.
Yeah, I know I have, I know I have gotten stuck and confused here and there along the way. I mean, it is an evolutionary world. And so, well, good, David. I'm trying to just look at a couple notes here and just see. One of the things that I wanted to just speak about briefly is just with this question of what types of training do you recommend to help people develop greater ethical awareness? It could be training, or what kind of support should people look for?
Well, one of the things I think is really valuable there is the ASI website. They do have ethical guidelines for spiritual teachers and for students,
Yeah.
perhaps to help give them a more realistic idea of what to expect from their teacher and Sangha and so on like that, or what's appropriate and what's not. Because it's really useful to have that discrimination in the first place.
Yeah.
Um,
So
also,
how does one develop discrimination? I'll put
well,
that.
that's to me as a matter of inner clarity, development of consciousness. But one of the things in a lot of spiritual circles is there's this emphasis on the renunciate approach of just consciousness itself, awakening in consciousness to consciousness, and just that sort of detached. There's this thing over here business, and it's got nothing to do with the world, and all the world's an illusion, and there's no person here, and that kind of thing.
So you're saying that doesn't work?
That doesn't really work for if you're in the world. Yeah, not at all.
Yeah, it doesn't work too good.
It creates a conflict, a duality in there.
Yeah,
And
of course.
so it's very useful to also understand, from my perspective, the evolution, the spiritual evolution has two sides, kind of the masculine and the feminine. Consciousness is kind of the Shiva aspect, the masculine. It emphasizes the detached witness and the world is illusion and so on like that. But the feminine side is the richness of the world and the flow of consciousness and bliss and basically what takes emptiness into fullness.
Yeah.
There's no fullness in consciousness if there isn't that development of the feminine, and that's essentially the body mind physiology we have to experience the world through. And certainly, from my perspective, what's important is to have a balance of those both. And there tends to be this overemphasis on the masculine, on consciousness in a lot of circles, but to bring out the feminine more. And that's more about refinement, about healing, about subtle awareness, refined perception, and that kind of thing. And as we become more aware of our own physiologies, we become conscious of our inner garbage energetically, and we can learn to heal that inside. And there's various people who teach energy healing techniques and so on. There's things like, some spiritual people have empath gifts. It's useful to understand the dynamics of that inside if that's going on. And basically becoming more aware of the dynamics between consciousness and the surface world, healing emotionally, letting go of those stories. Some of that goes on in a typical consciousness thing, letting go of the mental garbage. But again, when we develop the feminine side, there's greater clarity, and then from that place of a clear witness, we're able to much more precisely discriminate.
Yeah.
And so that's where it gets back into what you talked about before. We wake up, grow up, heal it, clean up, that cleanup part. And then you've got a much richer path. And if there is stuff going on, you're much more conscious of it. That's the thing, because this is all about consciousness. So if you're conscious of your junk, then you're much more likely to see the triggers going on and to be able to go in there and heal that stuff. Whereas if you're kind of suppressing it and keeping it in shadow and being oblivious to it, and that's the person is of no value, then that's going to bite you. And unfortunately, in a spiritual context, it's going to bite your students as well.
Yeah.
And it's important to note too, from that perspective of that, from the Vedic science side of the Vedic literature, they do talk about that, and messing up your students is really not very good karma for a teacher. So
On a scale of 1 to 10, David, what kind of karma is that?
I don't know, but it's kind of high up there.
Yeah, it's high up there. It's
So
up at the top.
you can because I've seen people throw people off the path as a result of their
Yeah,
behavior and disappointing the students and so on like that. And that's that's something that has to be resolved. It's
yeah,
on you. And if, it's much better to clean up the stuff that's there than to add all this other stuff on the pile that then
yeah,
you have to deal with later.
yeah. Yeah, and I think that's it's just so powerful what you're describing, that dance of the masculine and the feminine. And that's one of the beautiful things that woke up in me when I had a family, was just that feminine side. It's just, oh, this is all about love. You want to have the clarity there too, of course. You have the clarity, but it's like clarity with love, and then couple that with strength.
Yes,
And then we have
well put.
yeah, yeah. Then if we don't have those, if we're missing one of those, especially if we say of clarity, but with strength, but without the love, oh, we can become quite harsh, quite neurotic, quite cold and dead inside, and that'll be reflected in our
Yes.
life.
On the other hand, with love but without discrimination,
Yeah,
then
then we could be a bubbling mess.
off here, and you get people that have all kinds of fancy experiences but no grounding.
Yeah, yeah,
So it's the balance that's so
yeah,
important.
yeah, and that's the big deal. And that's what spiritual integrity is about, is that balance, or the realization of all these different aspects of self, all these different aspects of being. I like to just think of them, they're all qualities of awareness. If you just have awareness in the form of clarity, that's beautiful. But again, clarity without love, clarity without strength, clarity without being grounded, like you're describing, and there's a good chance we won't stay clear that long. Good
Yes,
chance.
or we'll have big blind spots. There'll be this illusion of clarity.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So, anyways, well, David, I think it was really nice chatting with you here today. I think we've been speaking for about an hour. Is there anything that you feel is unresolved, or any last points, or anything you'd like to make or add or correct?
Well, one general thing I would like to mention is that one of the things that's happening is there's a lot of people waking up because consciousness as a whole is rising.
Yeah,
And one of the things that's doing in the collective is, just like in the personal, it's bringing the garbage to the surface.
yeah,
And so a lot of what's happening in the news and so on like that we're seeing these days is this collective purification
yeah,
that's taking place. And it's important to understand that, because if we see it as collective purification, we can help potentially help assist that process and allow that to be healed and released. Whereas if we see it as some big drama and engage in in itself, we can be amplifying it and reinforcing it rather than healing it. And
or fall into despair with it.
yes, exactly. So understanding that that's part of the process of what's going on right now, and it's a healing process. It's not, we're not going, uh, uh, use a better analogy, we're not going down the tubes. It's an improvement. It's a challenging time, certainly,
Yeah.
but the net result, well, some saying in a couple of years, should be really good.
Yeah, yeah, and I think I'm glad you say that, David, because that's a good reminder, even for me personally. Because sometimes I check the news, and you start to, especially with this week, the big thing that came out was the burning of the Amazon rainforest, and that a lot of these forest fires most of them are being lit intentionally. So it's like farmers are trying to burn them intentionally so that they can have more land for cattle grazings to support the meat diet, or meat-based diet instead of a plant-based diet. And when I see things like this, and when you hear it and you watch the news and you get it from every level, there can be a sense of despair that can come forward. And it's a nice reminder that we're growing out of the darkness.
Yes.
And I do this with my clients every day. Is they'll face something really painful. I say, okay, let's open to this more let's embrace this, let's meet it with love. It just wants to empty out. And, this is happening, of course, on an individual level, and then it's happening on the collective level. And we all need to remind each other this, or it's very quick. It was very easy to fall into despair. And, one of the illusions around, integrity or spiritual growth or maturity on the path is you get to a place and everything's just completely peaceful and totally sane, and nothing moves. There's no emotions anymore, feeling or growth. And to me, I'm reminded more and more that the bigger the light, the more darkness you see. The bigger your awareness spreads out and expands, the more you'll see within yourself, within the consciousness of the planet, within the collective. And so,
Anywhere where the light is not.
Say that again?
Anywhere where the light is not.
Yeah, exactly. So anyways, it was wonderful to have you on the program today. And I appreciate what you brought, especially about this greater picture, of the different ages, that we're going through. Because I think that's something that most people don't think about. They don't allow themselves to see from a perspective that's that big. That's in a sense where you can actually step back from history itself and see, what's happening. So thanks so much. And it's been so nice having you on here today. David, why don't you remind everyone of your website, where you have all kinds of great articles and blogs and podcasts and things, which I think could be supportive to many people.
Well, thank you. Yes, my website is davidya.ca. So that's DAVIDYA.ca.
Yeah. So for more information or to get a hold of David, you can find him there. And David, thanks so much for being on the program today. It was an absolute pleasure.
You're more than welcome.
Yeah.
Great.